Welcome to the FAFSA Leadership Lounge, where we dive into the policy shaping the work of Florida school leaders. I'm Michelle White, Executive Director of the Florida Association of School Administrators.
And I'm Jessica Janasiewicz, lobbyist for FAFSA and for several school districts across the state of Florida.
Well, we want to start today with some great news and a huge thank you. We were notified last week that the FAFSA Leadership Lounge podcast has hit a huge milestone, 1,000 downloads, which is amazing. And in addition, we are approaching 800 unique listeners. So thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing the podcast. And thank you for all that you do.
This is amazing news. Thank y'all so much for listening and spreading the word about this podcast. And remember, if you're planning on attending FAFSA's Discover 26 conference in a little less than 2 months, you'll be able to be part of the podcast. That's right. We are going to record an episode of the Leadership Lounge during a general session at the conference.
That's right. So make sure that you're going to be there. You don't want to miss everything that we have planned, and probably even some live Q&A with Jessica and I. But let's get started with some interesting information this week. So a study has been released that says Dr. Susan McManus from USF shared that there is a study that shows how NPAs, so no party affiliations, and minor political parties are reshaping Florida's electorate.
It really is quite fascinating. She created a graph of Florida voter registrations from 1972 through to 2026, and the shifts in parties are just really quite interesting. For example, in 1972, the Democratic voter percentage was 70%, with about 28% being Republican and about 2% being the either no party affiliation or some other minor party. Today, Republicans are at 41%. Democrats are at 30%, and the NPA or other minor party is at 28%. Please note the totals may not equal 100% due to route.
So what does this really mean, and why are these NPAs growing so much? Well, for some people, it's pretty straightforward. They're frustrated with one party or both, or they just don't like the two-party system at all. Others are more of what you call single issue voters. They care deeply about one specific issue, and they don't feel like either major party really represents them on that front. Some voters prefer to keep an independent label for practical reasons. In certain professional settings, staying politically neutral, or at least appearing neutral, is what really matters to them.
Sure. And then you've got people whose views don't neatly fit into one party's box. Maybe they support progressive social policies, but lean more conservative when it comes to economic issues. That kind of mix can make a party affiliation feel kind of limiting and not really reflective of what their views are. And then some voters just aren't that plugged into politics. They may not have a clear sense of where each party stands, but they want to show up and participate, and maybe they don't want to pick a side. All of these differences make the non-party affiliated voters a tough group to pin down. You don't really know where they're going to go when they go in to vote. So it creates a real challenge for both of the major parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, as they try to win their support heading into the midterms later this year.
Yeah, a few other stats about our NPA voters that are kind of interesting. 70% of Florida NPA voters are Gen X, Gen Z, or millennials. And geographic areas with the most NPAs are around that Tampa, St. Petersburg, Sarasota area, as well as Orlando, Daytona Beach, Melbourne, and one other group in Miami, Fort Lauderdale. So each of these metro areas is over 20% NPA voter registration.
Wow, that really is fascinating. And you think this is certainly going to have an impact to some degree as we head into the midterms, to be sure. We saw the NPAs have a major impact in just those special elections that we just had a couple weeks ago. So speaking of elections and voting, there is some new polling for a current Senate seat, and we're talking U.S. Senate, that is pretty interesting. A public policy polling survey from last week finds appointed Senator Ashley Moody. So she was formerly our AG here in the state. The governor appointed her to the Senate seat formerly held by Marco Rubio, who is now, of course, Secretary of State. Um, she is leading the Democrat, Alex Vindman, by just 3 points. 43 to 40% is what this poll is saying. What makes this interesting is the sample. The poll rather mirrors the 24 style turnout, with Trump voters outnumbering Harris voters by double digits. So the poll isn't a Democratic leading electorate that they polled for this. So those are some interesting numbers. Of course, we've got a long way to go, but certainly interesting.
Absolutely. And of course, it raises some red flags for Moody. So, despite 7 years in statewide office, 43% of voters still have no opinion of her. Even among Republicans, fewer than half approve of her current performance. Vindman's campaign, of course, sees an opening, especially since he leads among independent and no party voters, though he still faces a Democratic primary. Altogether, it suggests that Florida may be less locked in than in recent elections might imply.
And it certainly does make you wonder, because we saw, um, some of these appointees where Governor DeSantis has moved folks around, what impact that may have. She didn't ever run for the Senate yet. She has, of course, run for AG and been successful. But it'll just, be interesting to see how this all plays out. Um, some other major news is that the state has stepped in last week to help with some financial issues in two of our rural school districts here in Florida, Union and Glades counties. Um, we knew this was something that was kind of in the works, and it could be, hopefully not, but it's certainly an indicator of some of the issues we've had with the enrollment numbers not being what they we thought they were going to be, and certainly the most recent set of numbers that really showed a very dramatic decline in students. It was not at all what was predicted. Republican Senator Jennifer Bradley called the districts the canary in the coal mine, and both were put under state financial oversight after their projected fund balances dropped below that 2%. Florida states that the fund balances can't fall below 3%. So that's why the state then got involved.
Absolutely. So in Union County, a recent state funding recalculation showed enrollment fell by more than 100 students, cutting nearly $1 million from the district's expected funding. Glades County saw a similar hit, losing 46 students and almost $350,000. District leaders say Florida's universal school voucher program is a big driver, even in counties with very few private schools. Union schools have already cut board benefits, canceled some bus routes, they've trimmed supply budgets, and even considered taking out a loan just to get through the year. Lawmakers tried to create a stabilization fund this session, but the bill stalled. As Senator Bradley put it, if money is supposed to follow the student, the system has to work. And right now, she says it doesn't.
That's right. And I think we talked about this on a prior podcast about, the dramatic drop in students that we saw in the last uh, report and calculation. And it may seem, when you're thinking about from a big district perspective, like how does 100 students or 46 students make a difference? But it makes a huge difference in a small district. Just the way thousands of students, that kind of hit makes a huge difference in a big school district. And of course, the issue here, the Senate acknowledged this in their part of their scholarship fix bill that they proposed that didn't end up going anywhere, was Senator Gates has stated, districts make decisions, hiring decisions, all of those things at the start of the school year based on the number of students they think they have. And there's only so much recalibration you can do mid-year, because if you think losing 46 students across a district, they're not all at one school. Or even losing 12,000 students, like I think was Miami-Dade's number. They're not all in one place. So it's not like, oh, you just get rid of that class or, those couple of classes and call it a day. It's just not how it works. And so the Senate really did acknowledge that we need to kind of have some way to get the schools through the school year when they've already made these decisions. Um, and so obviously that was one of the reasons that it was frustrating to not have that make it through this session.
Yeah,
And
and we know yeah, and, we know that these are challenging conversations that superintendents and school boards and principals are having to have too, right? Because it is impacting kids, it's impacting communities, in so many different ways, and, um, it's definitely a place to be watching what's going on, and we have seen districts in this place before and work out of it with, some general assistance. So we'll definitely keep listeners updated and, whether it's on the podcast or in FAFSA's newsletters. So please stay tuned for that.
absolutely, because it is absolutely possible that this becomes part of the budget conversation. The bill that the Senate proposed was a budget bill. And so it is very possible that whenever we get a budget, that this may be part of the discussion. And speaking of that, we got a little good news, bad news this week from the Senate president. He sent a letter just kind of giving an update on where the progress is with the budget discussions. He said that he and Senator Hooper have had some productive discussions with members of the House to try to get to allocations. That is, of course, the starting point for the budget negotiation is what is that top line number going to be? And then what each silo is going to get. So he said they've had productive discussions, but
But that's the good news because then he went on to say that the progress hasn't been strong enough to return to Tallahassee before the special session on redistricting. Which was called, of course, by Governor DeSantis, for, April 20th, that week, and he also said that the House and Senate are continuing to work together on completing a budget as soon as possible.
so we certainly hope that they do just that. Obviously, they don't technically we don't have to have a budget until the end of June when we get to the end of the fiscal year, but obviously that is not a great scenario. We found ourselves in that place last year. It's very challenging for our districts to make the decisions they need to make about hiring and placement and all of the things that they have to do um, when they don't know what their budget is going to be. So we certainly hope that we have some more news. But obviously they didn't make that target when they ended the traditional 2026 legislative session. That was what Senator Albright had said was his hope was that perhaps they'd come in before the redistricting session. Obviously, now we've heard, that's not going to happen, but hopefully it'll be sooner rather than later. So let's talk a bit about the scholarship program, which is um, probably the biggest driver for some of the issues that we've had fiscally with funding schools. And that is in part because it's been growing very fast. So, since applications opened on February 1st, more than 500,000 families have already applied for the scholarship program for next year. That's according to Step Up for Students, which it is there's two administrators of the state scholarship program. They are the big one. They by far manage the most. They say 200,000 applications came in just the first 3 days, if you can believe that. And by March 30th, applications hit 500,000. Last year, to get to that milestone, it took an extra 3 weeks. So obviously, a much more rapid growth and at least applications this year.
Yeah, and a number of those students, of course, could be those that are returning and they're reapplying, but certainly it does show growth. And this surge comes even, of course, as lawmakers are raising alarms about transparency and missing money in the program. We heard a lot about that during the session and during committee weeks. Despite those concerns, of course, we know the legislature has failed to pass major reforms during the 2026 session. A bill that cleared the Senate but never reached the House would have overhauled that system, including better tracking of students after auditors found tens of thousands that couldn't be located representing hundreds of millions in taxpayer dollars. And, of course, things can move now that they're going to still have to pass a budget. More language could be added. But on the policy side of things, that could be a little bit harder to overcome now that that bill is dead.
Absolutely. And we'll have to see, it was one of those kind of perplexing things during the session that the House held so many committee meetings on the scholarship program and the issues that were found with the audit that they did. Um, and the Senate had meetings as well, but the House really had more than the Senate actually in committee meetings talking about it. And the Senate then produced their fix bill, and we never saw anything from the House, but it seemed like at least, when it came to, the big ideas and the fact that it needed a fix, there seemed to be some agreement on that issue. So, hopefully, the reason it died during this last session was the politics of the House and the Senate not getting along with anything and basically not taking anything that one side wanted. If the Senate wanted something, the House said no. The House wanted something, the Senate said no. It was kind of what we ended up with this year. So the hope that I think we would have is that perhaps when they get allocations and they've come together at least on a number, maybe they can also come together on some ideas around some of these reforms. Because certainly, I think the legislature generally saying would say that this program is a success. Step Up says that there's more than 525,000 students that are currently funded in the program. So if you look at that just from a numbers perspective, that would make it by far the largest school district in the state of Florida. So, I mean, obviously there is a lot of desire for this. So we shall see. Renewal deadlines are come into play on April 30th. And it doesn't seem like the demand is slowing down anytime soon. So we'll see how the legislature reacts to this. Hopefully soon when they come together for a budget.
Yes. So fingers crossed. Of course, we will be monitoring all of the work that's happening between now and then. There's still a lot going on, even though they're not talking about policy. So stay tuned and listen for future episodes. We'll dive in a little bit more for the policies that did pass and starting to really track which ones the governor is signing into law, versus maybe just letting take effect, or if he plans to veto any. So stay tuned. More to come from the FAFSA Leadership Lounge. Again, we started it, and I want to end it with a big thank you to everybody for listening and sharing and then watching some of our video clips on social media. It's making a difference, and we're excited to support and help inform leaders across the state about what's happening in education policy. So thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Lounge podcast presented by the Florida Association of School Administrators. Today's podcast was hosted by Michelle White and Jessica Janasiewicz. The podcast was produced by Jeff Willoughby. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. New episodes are released each Monday. For show topics, suggestions, questions, or comments, please email communications@fasa.net. We hope you enjoyed the show.